Most people who talk about the Vietnam War say it was misunderstood, that the American public never really grasped what was happening over there, that the fog of war obscured the reality, that confusion was an unfortunate byproduct of a complicated conflict in a complicated time. That framing is itself a form of protection. It assumes the problem was one of communication, of distance, of cultural difficulty. It suggests that somewhere, at some level of the chain of command, someone had an accurate picture of what was happening and simply failed to convey it effectively. That is not what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows, piece by piece, declassified document by declassified document, testimony by testimony, is that the misrepresentation was not a failure of communication. It was the system working as intended. The Vietnam War produced more internal contradictions than almost any conflict in modern American history, and most of those contradictions were not accidents. They were the result of an institutional culture that had decided, somewhere around 1963 or 1964, that the appearance of progress mattered more than progress itself. Once that decision was made, everything downstream from it followed a kind of terrible logic. The numbers had to go up. The reports had to sound optimistic. The briefings had to project confidence. And the people on the ground, the ones actually experiencing the war, had to find ways to either participate in that system or be destroyed by it. What gets lost in most accounts of Vietnam is how early that erosion began. People tend to think of the late 1960s as the period when things fell apart, when fragging incidents started appearing in the reports, when soldiers began refusing orders, when drug use became epidemic, when the morale of American forces collapsed into something barely recognizable. But the groundwork for all of that was laid years earlier, in decisions that were made quietly, in offices by people who never went near the jungle. The body count metric is probably the most well-known example of how the war was measured in ways that had almost nothing to do with military reality, but it is worth going back to the beginning of that system to understand how it actually functioned. When Robert McNamara arrived at the Pentagon as Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, he brought with him a philosophy of management that had worked, or appeared to work, in the corporate world. You could measure anything. You could quantify success. You could reduce complex systems to numbers and use those numbers to make decisions. In the context of a conventional war, where territory changed hands and supply lines could be mapped and tank formations could be counted, that philosophy had a certain coherence. In Vietnam, it became something else entirely. The problem was that the war in Vietnam did not produce the kinds of measurable outcomes that McNamara's system required. There was no front line to advance. There were no cities being captured and held. There was no equivalent of the march across France or the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. What there was instead was an enemy that moved through the population, that absorbed losses and continued operating, that had no fixed infrastructure to destroy. In the absence of conventional metrics, the military settled on body count as the primary measure of progress. How many enemy combatants had been killed? That number would, in theory, indicate whether the war was being won. What followed was one of the most sustained and systematic distortions of military data in American history. The pressure to produce favorable body counts came from every level of the chain of command simultaneously. Brigade commanders wanted high numbers to show to division commanders. Division commanders wanted high numbers to show to generals. Generals wanted high numbers to show to the Pentagon. The Pentagon wanted high numbers to show to Congress and the White House. And at each level, the numbers were adjusted, inflated, sometimes invented outright. The process was not secret. It was not hidden from the people participating in it. It was simply understood to be how the system worked. At the ground level, this pressure produced consequences that were documented, reported through official channels, and then buried. Units in the field were sometimes given informal quotas. Patrols that came back without bodies were viewed with suspicion. The line between confirmed enemy combatants and any Vietnamese person who happened to be in a designated free-fire zone became, in practice, almost non-existent. There is a phrase that became common in the war, a phrase that soldiers used with a kind of grim matter-of-factness. If it's dead, and Vietnamese it's VC. That phrase was not the product of individual moral failure. It was the logical endpoint of a system that rewarded death without requiring accuracy. The free fire zones themselves are worth examining because they represent one of the most complete erasures of civilian distinction in the American conduct of the war. A free fire zone, officially designated a specified strike zone, was an area in which any person present could be considered a legitimate military target. The theory was that these zones had been cleared of civilian population, and that anyone remaining had either chosen to stay in support of the enemy or was enemy themselves. The reality was different in almost every case. Civilians did not always leave when told to leave. They had crops, livestock, ancestral graves, family members who could not travel. They stayed, and once an area was designated a free fire zone, their presence did not prevent them from being killed. It became the justification for killing them. The records of civilian casualties in free fire zones were not, for the most part, accurately kept. When civilian deaths were reported at all, they were frequently reclassified. The procedures for distinguishing a civilian from a combatant after death were, in many cases, reduced to whether the person was carrying a weapon. If they were not carrying a weapon could be placed near the body. That practice is documented in enough first-hand accounts, in enough testimony given to official inquiries, that it cannot be dismissed as isolated or exaggerated. It was common enough to have its own informal logic within the system. What the Pentagon Papers revealed when they were leaked in 1971 was not primarily that atrocities had occurred. Most informed observers already understood that atrocities occurred in Vietnam. What the papers revealed was the gap between what the government knew and what it said publicly, a gap that had been maintained with great deliberateness across multiple administrations, across both parties, across 4 consecutive presidents. The papers showed that as early as 1965, internal assessments were deeply pessimistic about the likelihood of success. They showed that decision-makers knew the bombing campaigns were not achieving their stated objectives. They showed that the escalation decisions were made not because they were expected to work, but because the alternative, the public acknowledgement of failure, was politically unacceptable. Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the papers, had worked inside that system. He had been a true believer at one point, a man who thought the war could be won, and that his analytical skills could contribute to winning it. What changed him was not ideology, it was repetition. He kept seeing the same optimistic projections, followed by the same failures, followed by the same revised projections, and he eventually recognized that the process had no relationship to truth. It was a machine for producing confidence that bore no connection to conditions in the field. The operational details of Operation Rolling Thunder illustrate this disconnect with particular clarity. Rolling Thunder was the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that ran from 1965 to 1968. Its stated objectives shifted repeatedly during those years, from interdicting supply lines to coercing Hanoi, to demonstrating American resolve, to degrading North Vietnamese industrial capacity. The bombing was sustained, intensive, and expensive. More bombs were dropped on North Vietnam during Rolling Thunder than the United States had dropped in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. The results were, by the internal assessments that were classified and not shared with the public, essentially negligible in strategic terms. The North Vietnamese had anticipated that their fixed infrastructure would be targeted. They dispersed their supply networks, moved factories into caves and tunnels, relied heavily on human carriers and bicycle transport, rather than motor vehicles that could be identified and struck from the air. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which served as the primary supply route from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam, was bombed continuously and continuously repaired. Analysts estimated that for every $1 of damage the bombing caused, North Vietnam spent a fraction of $1 to repair it. The math did not work. The internal report said the math did not work. But Rolling Thunder continued. The reason it continued is itself a kind of secret that was never meant to be public. Stopping the bombing would have required an admission that it was not working. An admission that it was not working would have raised the broader question of whether the strategy it was meant to support was working. And that question, once posed publicly, had only one honest answer. So the bombing continued, and the reports describing its ineffectiveness were classified, and the briefings to Congress described progress being made. There is a particular kind of institutional momentum that develops in a large bureaucracy committed to a failing policy. It is not exactly dishonesty, though dishonesty is part of it. It is more like a collective decision to protect the system from information that would destabilize it. The people inside the system are not, for the most part, villains in any simple sense. They are people who have built careers, who have institutional loyalties, who have internalized the belief that the system they serve is fundamentally legitimate and that its failures are temporary and correctable. When the evidence says otherwise, the evidence tends to be the thing that gets adjusted. This process was visible in the Strategic Hamlet program, which was one of the earlier large-scale counterinsurgency efforts in Vietnam, running primarily from 1962 to 1964. The program was built on the idea that the rural population of South Vietnam needed to be physically separated from the Viet Cong, who relied on those villages for food, intelligence, recruits, and sanctuary. If you could move the population into fortified hamlets that could be defended and controlled, you could cut the insurgency off from its base of support. It was a coherent theory. It was also a catastrophic failure in practice. The hamlets were often built using forced labor. Peasants were moved away from their ancestral lands, away from the graves of their families, away from the rice paddies they had farmed for generations, into unfamiliar locations that offered them nothing except the proximity of a government that many of them already distrusted. The South Vietnamese government, under Ngo Dinh Diem, administered the program with a combination of incompetence and corruption that ensured its failure almost from the beginning. Hamlet chiefs siphoned off the funds meant for construction. Hamlets that existed only on paper were reported as completed and operational. American advisors knew this. Their reports described the discrepancies between official claims and reality. Those reports were filtered through a chain of command that had decided the program was politically necessary and that therefore its failures needed to be minimized. The number of completed hamlets reported to Washington bore almost no relationship to the number that actually existed in any functional sense. When the Diem government was overthrown in November 1963, with the tacit approval of the Kennedy administration, one of the things that came to light was how thoroughly the strategic hamlet numbers had been falsified. By some estimates, the actual number of functioning hamlets was less than a quarter of the number officially reported. The coup against Diem, which resulted in his assassination along with his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, is itself a story about information that was shaped for political purposes. The Kennedy administration had grown deeply frustrated with Diem, with his political repression, with his family's arrogance, with the Buddhist crisis that had produced the self-immolations that shocked the world. But the decision to allow or encourage a coup was made against a background of classified assessments that expressed significant uncertainty about what would come after Diem. Those assessments warned that South Vietnam's political situation might deteriorate further without a strong central authority, that a succession of military juntas could produce instability worse than what Diem represented. Those assessments were accurate. South Vietnam went through something like 9 changes of government in the 2 years following the coup, and the political instability they produced significantly complicated American military operations. None of that uncertainty was communicated to the American public, which was told that the change in leadership represented a new opportunity to stabilize South Vietnam and pursue the war more effectively. What followed was a period of such intense political chaos in Saigon that American military planners were sometimes unable to get basic decisions made by the South Vietnamese government because there was uncertainty about who actually held authority. The decision to escalate American involvement in 1964 and 1965 was made against this background of political instability in Saigon. continued military stalemate in the countryside, and internal assessments that ranged from pessimistic to deeply pessimistic. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which provided the legal pretext for that escalation, is perhaps the most studied example of how the Johnson administration managed information about Vietnam, and yet its full dimensions are still not commonly understood. The first incident on August 2, 1964, was real. North Vietnamese torpedo boats did attack the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. The attack was retaliatory, responding to South Vietnamese commando raids against North Vietnamese coastal installations in which American forces were directly involved, though that context was not disclosed to Congress when the administration sought authorization for military retaliation. The second incident on August 4th almost certainly did not happen. The radar contacts and sonar readings that were initially reported as a second attack were, within hours, being questioned by the officers on scene. Captain John Herrick, the commander of the task force, sent a message to Washington recommending a complete reassessment of the reported attack before any action was taken, suggesting that the initial reports may have been the result of over-eager sonar operators in rough seas detecting their own ship's wake. That message existed. It was in the communications record. It was available to the administration when it was deciding how to respond. Lyndon Johnson went before Congress and the American people and described a deliberate, unprovoked attack on American naval vessels in international waters. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave the president effectively unlimited authority to escalate the war, passed the Senate with 2 dissenting votes. What the senators voting for it did not know was that the administration had serious internal doubts about whether the second attack had occurred at all. This is one of the secrets that was never meant to be public, and for a long time, it was not. The classified communications that established those doubts did not become fully public until decades later. When Robert McNamara, late in his life, revisited the Gulf of Tonkin incident with the benefit of access to those documents, he concluded that the second attack almost certainly had not happened. He said so publicly. He said it in interviews and in documentary films and in a memoir that carried the weight of someone who had been present for the decision. It came 40 years after the fact. The ground war that followed the Gulf of Tonkin escalation produced its own catalogue of suppressed and distorted information. The search and destroy operations that became the primary tactical approach under General William Westmoreland were built on the concept of attrition. The idea that if American forces could kill enough enemy soldiers at a high enough rate, the enemy would eventually be unable to continue fighting. Westmoreland called this the crossover point, the moment when enemy losses would exceed their capacity to replace them. The crossover point kept being projected into the near future. It kept not arriving. What the attrition strategy required to maintain any claim of progress was a continuous supply of favorable casualty ratios. American losses compared to enemy losses needed to stay at a level that suggested the strategy was working. This requirement shaped tactics in ways that were rarely acknowledged officially. Units were sometimes committed to engagements not because of their strategic value, but because they would generate enemy casualties that could be reported upward. The distinction between taking ground for a purpose and taking ground to produce a body count became increasingly blurred, and then in many cases disappeared entirely. The battle at Hamburger Hill in May of 1969 became a public symbol of this problem, but it was not exceptional. It was representative. Hamburger Hill, known officially as Dong Ap Bia, was a fortified North Vietnamese position in the A Shau Valley. American and South Vietnamese forces attacked it repeatedly over 10 days, taking significant casualties, eventually capturing it, and then 11 days later, abandoning it. There was no strategic reason to hold the hill. Westmoreland's successor, General Crichton Abrams, had himself questioned the logic of costly battles for positions that would not be held. The hill was taken because it was there and because it was defended, and the calculus of attrition demanded that defended positions be attacked. The operation produced 72 American dead and over 372 wounded. The hill was abandoned because holding it served no purpose that anyone could articulate. When a senator described the battle as senseless and irresponsible, the criticism landed because it was accurate, and also because American reporters had been present and had filed accounts that did not match the official description of the operation as a significant military success. The gap between what was seen and what was said had become wide enough that it could no longer be reliably managed. That gap had been widening for years, but the internal management of it was itself a significant institutional operation. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, maintained a sophisticated public affairs apparatus whose function was not simply to communicate information, but to shape the narrative of the war in ways that would maintain public and congressional support. This is not unusual for a military organization in wartime. What made MACV's operation distinctive was the degree to which it involved the deliberate suppression and distortion of information that conflicted with the official narrative. Reporters who wrote critically about the war found their access restricted. Correspondents who developed sources within the military that contradicted official briefings were sometimes the subject of complaints to their editors or their news organizations. The official daily briefings in Saigon, which reporters referred to as the 5 o'clock follies, became notorious for the disconnect between what they reported and what journalists were observing in the field. Casualty figures were routinely understated. Enemy strength figures were maintained at levels that served the narrative of progress, even when intelligence assessments supported higher estimates. The dispute over enemy order of battle in 1967 is one of the clearest examples of how intelligence was shaped to fit a predetermined conclusion. The Central Intelligence Agency's analysts, led by a man named Sam Adams, had been working on estimates of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese strength and had concluded that the actual numbers were significantly higher than the figures MACV was reporting. Adams and other analysts believed the enemy force was roughly twice as large as MACV's official estimates acknowledged. If those higher figures were accepted, they would have made the claim that the war was being won through attrition essentially impossible to sustain. What followed was not a resolution of the intelligence dispute through analysis. What followed was a political process in which MACV's figures, the lower figures, were essentially imposed on the official estimate. The CIA analysts who supported higher numbers were pressured. The methodology used to count certain categories of enemy forces, particularly the local irregular forces and the political infrastructure, was changed in ways that conveniently reduced the overall total. An intelligence estimate is supposed to be a product of analysis. This one was partly a product of institutional need. Sam Adams continued fighting the issue internally for years. He eventually resigned and wrote about the episode. He testified before Congress. A television documentary based partly on his work resulted in a defamation lawsuit by Westmoreland that produced a trial in which a great deal of the internal evidence about the order of battle dispute became part of the public record. Westmoreland eventually withdrew the lawsuit before it reached a verdict. The evidence that had been introduced suggested that the suppression of higher enemy strength estimates had been real, deliberate, and consequential. The consequences became visible during Tet. On the night of January 30th, 1968, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, including the capital Saigon, including the ancient imperial city of Hue, including a penetration of the American embassy compound in Saigon that lasted several hours. The scale of the offensive was made possible in part because the enemy forces were larger than the official estimates had acknowledged, and because the infrastructure that coordinated and supplied those forces was more extensive than official assessments had reported. The Tet Offensive was a military failure for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong in the narrow sense that they did not hold the cities they attacked, that they took catastrophic losses, that the general uprising they had hoped to trigger among the South Vietnamese population did not materialize, but it destroyed the credibility of the official narrative in a way that no battlefield defeat could repair. American officials had been saying for months that the war was going well, that the enemy was being weakened, that progress was measurable and real. The images of Viet Cong fighters inside the American embassy compound said something different. The weeks-long battle for Hue, which resulted in the systematic execution of thousands of civilians by North Vietnamese forces and the near destruction of the city during its recapture, said something different. Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam after Tet and came back and said on national television that the war appeared to be a stalemate. Johnson reportedly said that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost America. What is less often discussed is that the intelligence failure of Tet was not simply a failure. Parts of it were a manufactured failure. The analysts who had been raising concerns about enemy strength and capability for years had been overruled. The indicators of a major offensive in the months before Tet had been present in the intelligence record. They had been interpreted in ways that fit the existing narrative rather than challenged it. When the offensive came, it was not that no one had seen it coming. It was that the institutional framework made seeing it coming inconvenient. After Tet, the war continued for 7 more years. That fact deserves to sit with some weight. The offensive that shattered public confidence in the war's management, that drove Lyndon Johnson to announce he would not seek re-election, that produced the beginning of formal negotiations in Paris, did not end the war. The war continued. American forces continued to fight and die. Vietnamese civilians continued to die in enormous numbers. The bombing continued and expanded. And the machinery of false reporting, of inflated body counts, of optimistic briefings that did not match conditions on the ground, also continued because it was the only machinery that existed. Nixon's policy of Vietnamization, which was meant to transfer the war's fighting burden to South Vietnamese forces, while American troops were gradually withdrawn, produced its own set of information problems. The assessment of South Vietnamese military capability was, for most of the war, deeply unreliable. South Vietnamese units that existed on paper sometimes did not exist in practice. Corruption within the South Vietnamese military meant that the American equipment and supplies provided to those units were routinely diverted, sold on the black market, or simply lost. The pacification of the countryside, which was essential to Vietnamization's logic, depended on accurate assessments of which areas were under government control. Those assessments were produced by a system called the Hamlet Evaluation System, which relied on local officials reporting on local conditions, and which was therefore subject to exactly the same pressures toward optimism that had distorted every other metric of the war. The Phoenix program, which was the centerpiece of the American effort to dismantle the Viet Cong political infrastructure through capture and assassination, operated with a level of accountability that ranged from minimal to non-existent. The program's stated goal was to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, the political cadres and local organizers who provided the insurgency with its local knowledge and its connection to the rural population. Neutralization was a term that covered arrest, defection, and killing, and the proportions varied considerably depending on who was keeping the records. The Phoenix program did kill large numbers of people. The official figure of 20,587 enemy infrastructure members killed between 1968 and 1971 is itself almost certainly an undercount, and it includes a category called killed in action resisting arrest that covered a considerable range of circumstances. Former CIA officer William Colby, who ran the program, testified before Congress that abuses had occurred. Provincial reconnaissance units, the paramilitary forces that carried out many Phoenix operations, were described by American advisors in internal reports as unreliable and prone to targeting personal enemies or extracting extortion payments rather than pursuing actual Viet Cong infrastructure. The distinction between a Viet Cong infrastructure member and a village official or local organizer who had been denounced by a neighbor for personal reasons was not always carefully made. Congressional testimony and later investigations established that the program had resulted in the deaths of a number of people who were not actually connected to the Viet Cong at all, and that the number was not small. The political dynamics of South Vietnam meant that Phoenix could be and was used as a tool for settling scores between Vietnamese factions that had nothing to do with the broader conflict. American advisors in the field documented this. Their documentation was generally absorbed into a reporting system that produced favorable aggregate statistics and did not dwell on inconvenient particulars. The expansion of the war into Cambodia, which Nixon announced in April of 1970, had been preceded by years of secret bombing that was not acknowledged to Congress or the American public. Operation Menu, which included component operations with names like breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, dessert, and supper, was a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnamese base areas and supply routes in Cambodia that began in March of 1969. The bombing was conducted using a falsified reporting system in which crews were debriefed on the real target locations, but those locations were replaced with false coordinates in the official records. The number of people involved in maintaining this deception was not small, and the system for maintaining it was elaborate enough that it required deliberate institutional effort. When the bombing was eventually revealed, first through investigative reporting and then through the testimony of military personnel who had participated in the falsification of records, it produced one of the articles of impeachment recommended against Nixon in the Watergate proceedings. Not the bombing itself, which many argued was legally and strategically defensible, but the deliberate falsification of military records. That article of impeachment was eventually dropped. The falsification of those records remained part of the documented history. The My Lai massacre of March 16, 1968, is the event in the Vietnam War most often cited when the subject of American atrocities comes up, and its details are widely enough known that they do not require extensive repetition here. What is less widely known is the context in which it occurred, the context in which it was nearly suppressed, and the context in which it was eventually revealed. The massacre of somewhere between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians in the hamlet of My Lai was not discovered through official investigation. It was concealed through official processes for more than a year. It became public because a soldier named Ron Riddenhauer, who had heard about it from other soldiers, wrote letters to the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, and members of Congress. Most of those recipients did not pursue it. It was eventually investigated because Riddenhauer's letter reached someone who could not ignore it. But the investigation might not have happened at all if Riddenhauer had not been persistent. The Army investigation that followed, led by General William Peers, produced a report that documented not only the massacre itself, but the systematic cover-up that had followed it. Officers at multiple levels of the chain of command had known what happened and had taken steps to ensure that accurate information did not travel upward. Incident reports were falsified. After-action reports described an operation against an armed enemy force. The cover-up involved not just the unit directly involved, but officers at brigade and division level who had enough information to act and chose not to. The Peers report named 30 individuals who should face charges in connection with the massacre and cover-up. Only one person, Lieutenant William Calley, was ultimately convicted of anything. He served about 3.5 years under house arrest before his sentence was commuted. The response to Calley's conviction, which included widespread public sympathy for him in certain quarters, letters to the White House in his support, and Nixon's intervention to have him released from military confinement, is itself a document of how the war had eroded certain moral categories in American public discourse. The question of whether an officer who ordered and participated in the systematic killing of unarmed civilians deserved punishment became a political question, a culture war question, a question about who was loyal to the troops and who was betraying them. The political mechanics of that debate are familiar because they have recurred in discussions of military accountability since then. What the Peers investigation also documented, though this received less attention, was that My Lai was not a uniquely aberrant event. The investigation found evidence of other incidents in the same operational area that had not been reported or had been misreported. Subsequent investigations and testimony established that similar incidents had occurred in other parts of Vietnam, under other commands, at different times. The Tiger Force, an elite unit of the 101st Airborne Division, is documented in a series of investigative reports and in a book-length account as having committed extended atrocities over months of operations in the Central Highlands in 1967. The internal Army investigation into Tiger Force, which was begun and then quietly closed without any charges being brought, remained classified for decades. The pattern was consistent. An incident would occur, a report would sometimes be filed, the report would be reviewed by people who had institutional interests in not pursuing it, and the file would be closed. The system was not designed to surface these events. It was designed, functionally if not explicitly, to absorb them. The drug epidemic among American forces in Vietnam is a subject that was discussed publicly in congressional hearings and news coverage from the late 1960s onward. What was less publicly discussed was the institutional response to it and the ways in which that response was itself shaped by the broader culture of managed information. By 1971, the Army estimated that roughly 10 to 15% of enlisted personnel in Vietnam were heroin users, and some estimates went higher. Marijuana use was pervasive. Amphetamine use among pilots was encouraged and supplied by flight surgeons in some units. The response to this crisis was complicated by the fact that acknowledging its scale was politically difficult, that punishing drug users in large numbers would have further degraded the already fragile operational effectiveness of American forces, and that the heroin flowing into Vietnam came substantially through networks connected to South Vietnamese military and political figures whose cooperation the United States needed. There is documented evidence that American officials were aware that South Vietnamese government-connected figures were involved in the heroin trade, and that this knowledge was subordinated to political and strategic considerations. Research drawing on CIA and DEA documents established that the drug trade through Southeast Asia involved networks that had relationships with American intelligence operations going back to the early Cold War period. The connections between Air America, the CIA's proprietary airline, and the opium trade in the Golden Triangle were documented extensively and disputed with approximately the same level of conviction as the evidence warranted. The disputes tended to focus on the degree of institutional knowledge and complicity rather than on whether any connection existed. The consequences of the drug epidemic for unit cohesion and combat effectiveness were documented internally and not publicly disclosed with any accuracy. Commanders who reported high drug use in their units risked being seen as unable to maintain discipline. The incentive structure, again, ran toward underreporting. Official statistics on drug use were challenged by medical personnel in the field as significant undercounts. When soldiers were rotated back to the United States with serious heroin addictions, the military did not, for a considerable period, have effective treatment protocols in place, and the problem transferred into American communities in ways that were not publicly connected to the war's management. The fragging phenomenon, the killing or attempted killing of officers and NCOs by their own soldiers, emerged in the late 1960s and accelerated in the early 1970s as American withdrawal created a particular kind of institutional stress. Soldiers who believed the war was over, who knew the United States was pulling out, were being asked to risk their lives for objectives that had no discernible strategic purpose. The incentive to minimize personal risk in that environment was enormous. Officers who pushed their units into aggressive operations faced the possibility that their soldiers would decide the risk was unacceptable. The documented number of fragging incidents increased dramatically between 1969 and 1972. The official figures, which were widely believed to be undercounts, showed roughly 800 incidents over the period of the war, with 86 officers killed. The actual number of officers killed by their own soldiers was believed by investigators to be considerably higher, because many such deaths could be attributed to combat in ways that were not easily disproved. The investigation of suspected fraggings was complicated by the same institutional dynamics that complicated the investigation of other forms of misconduct. The chain of command had limited appetite for the kind of scrutiny that would expose the depth of the morale crisis. The official response to the morale crisis in the early 1970s included the development of more aggressive anti-drug programs, the implementation of measures to improve living conditions on bases, and a general shift toward a posture of managed withdrawal rather than aggressive operations. None of these measures addressed the underlying problem, which was that the war had lost any discernible purpose while continuing to consume lives. The soldiers who were there in 1971 and 1972 knew, as a simple factual matter, that the United States was leaving. They knew it because it was public policy, and they were asked to continue fighting while that process played out, for reasons that no one could explain to them in terms that corresponded to reality. The role of South Korea in the Vietnam War is something that received almost no public attention in the United States and continues to receive relatively little historical examination in American accounts. South Korea sent approximately 325,000 troops to Vietnam between 1964 and 1973, making it by far the largest contributor of foreign forces after the United States. Korean forces were paid for by the United States at a rate that significantly supplemented the South Korean government's budget, and that was a substantial factor in South Korea's economic development during this period. The arrangement was not publicly described in those terms. Korean forces in Vietnam developed a reputation for exceptional combat effectiveness and also for exceptional brutality. Documented massacres by Korean forces included the Bin Hoa massacre and the Bin An massacre, in which civilian casualties were significant. These events were reported by American military advisors and journalists. They were documented in military records, and they were substantially suppressed from public discussion. The political and strategic value of the Korean contribution to the war effort meant that American officials were reluctant to scrutinize Korean conduct in ways that might threaten the relationship. The Vietnamese civilians who died in those operations died in ways that were not included in the official accounting of the war's costs. Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines also contributed forces, and the political arrangements surrounding those contributions involved various forms of American financial and diplomatic support that were not fully disclosed at the time. The framing of the war as a multilateral effort to resist communist aggression was maintained through arrangements that were more transactional than the public framing suggested. The bombing of Laos, which ran from the early 1960s through 1973, was one of the most intensive air campaigns in history and was conducted almost entirely in secret for years. Laos was officially neutral. American bombing of Laos was therefore officially not happening. The CIA ran a covert army, the Army Clandestine under Vang Pao, that fought a parallel war against the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese forces in Laos, funded by the United States through classified budgets, supplied through air operations that were not acknowledged in official military records. The scale of the bombing, when it eventually became known, was staggering. The United States dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos over 9 years, making Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. A significant proportion of those bombs did not explode on impact. The unexploded ordnance remaining in Laos continues to kill people today at a rate of several dozen deaths per year. The secret bombing of Laos was maintained through a combination of classification, deliberate misreporting, and the political convenience of a situation in which the Laotian government was willing to maintain the fiction of neutrality in exchange for American support. Congressional oversight of the operation was minimal. When reports of the bombing began to surface in the late 1960s, the official response was denial, followed by acknowledgement of a very limited operation, followed by eventual admission of the scale, which happened incrementally over years. The treatment of American prisoners of war in North Vietnam involved documented use of torture, of extended solitary confinement, of conditions that produced lasting physical and psychological damage. This was known to American officials through various channels from relatively early in the war. The decision about how publicly to press the prisoner of war issue involved strategic calculations about negotiations that sometimes ran counter to the interest of the prisoners themselves. There were periods in which the Nixon administration's calculations about the Paris negotiations led it to suppress or moderate public advocacy for the prisoners in ways that conflicted with what maximum public pressure might have achieved. The broader question of prisoners and missing personnel, who may have been left behind when American forces withdrew in 1973, became one of the most politically charged issues in the post-war period. The official position was that all living American prisoners had been returned. The evidence for this position was primarily North Vietnamese assurances, which were hardly an unimpeachable source. Internal Defense Intelligence Agency assessments in the years following the war included credible reports of Americans still alive in Southeast Asia that were not resolved definitively. The political and financial costs of a serious investigation into those reports, which would have required sustained diplomatic engagement with Vietnam and Laos at a time when no diplomatic relations existed, were assessed as prohibitive, and the reports were administratively closed in ways that did not necessarily reflect confident conclusions about their accuracy. The Agent Orange story is one that was long in becoming fully public, and aspects of it remain contested. The United States military used approximately 19 million gallons of herbicides in Vietnam between 1961 and 1971, of which Agent Orange was the most widely used. The herbicides were applied to defoliate jungle cover and destroy crops in areas believed to support enemy forces. The companies that manufactured Agent Orange knew, from their own internal research, that the production process created a highly toxic contaminant, dioxin, specifically 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, at levels that animal studies had suggested posed serious health risks. That knowledge was not shared with the military or with the government when the contracts were awarded. The Department of Defense did not require health and safety data from the manufacturers. American service members who handled the chemicals, who flew through defoliated areas, who operated on ground that had been sprayed, were not informed of potential risks. The Vietnamese population in sprayed areas received no warning at all. The long-term health consequences for American veterans who were exposed, including elevated rates of certain cancers, neurological disorders, and birth defects in their children, were denied by the government for years. The Department of Veterans Affairs resisted acknowledging the connection between Agent Orange exposure and specific health conditions through administrative processes that required veterans to prove causation in individual cases, a standard that was scientifically unreasonable and practically unachievable for most claimants. The eventual recognition of Agent Orange-related conditions as service-connected came after decades of veteran advocacy, congressional pressure, and litigation. The settlements with the manufacturers, which did not include admission of liability, provided a compensation fund for veterans that many advocates considered inadequate. The environmental and health consequences in Vietnam itself were not formally addressed by the United States government for decades after the war ended. Studies of areas where Agent Orange was heavily applied found elevated rates of certain cancers and birth defects in the population that have continued across generations. The specific story of the Bien Hoa Air Base, where Agent Orange and other herbicides were stored and where significant contamination of soil and groundwater occurred, is a case study in how long it takes for official acknowledgement of environmental damage to produce remediation. The contamination at Bien Hoa was documented in studies conducted by American and Vietnamese scientists. It was acknowledged by American officials. Remediation was discussed for years before any significant work began. The populations living near the base who were exposed to contaminated soil and water and who experienced elevated rates of related health conditions experienced that delay as what it was. The war's psychological dimensions, particularly the lasting effects on veterans, were also managed and then inadequately addressed for decades. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a recognized diagnosis when the war ended. Veterans who returned with symptoms of what would later be recognized as PTSD encountered a mental health system that did not have effective frameworks for understanding their experience. Many were told that their symptoms were character weaknesses. Many were given medications that managed symptoms without addressing underlying causes. Many self-medicated with alcohol and drugs. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans exceeded the combat death toll of the war over the decades following it, though the precise figures are debated because of how suicide data is collected and attributed. The VA system that was supposed to serve Vietnam veterans was underfunded, bureaucratically rigid, and at times actively hostile to the specific needs of a generation whose experience of war had been different from the experiences the system had been built to address. The combination of Agent Orange denial, PTSD non-recognition, and inadequate service provision meant that many of the war's costs were borne by the people who had fought it, quietly, in the years and decades after the last helicopter left Saigon. The fall of Saigon in April 1975, which became the most powerful single image of the war in the public memory, through photographs and film footage of helicopters on rooftops and crowds pressing against embassy gates, was the culmination of a process that had been understood internally to be likely for at least 2 years. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 had ended direct American military involvement, but they had not produced a stable settlement. American officials who assessed the likely durability of the South Vietnamese government after the withdrawal of American forces did not, in most cases, project confidence that the government would survive for long without continued American military and economic support. That assessment was not prominently shared with Congress or the public. When the North Vietnamese offensive of 1975 began, and moved with a speed that surprised even optimistic observers, the American response was to watch and provide very limited additional support. The decision not to intervene militarily was made in a context in which Congress had prohibited it, in which public opinion made it politically impossible, in which the cumulative effect of years of misrepresentation had so thoroughly destroyed trust in official assessments of the war that no argument for continued involvement could be made credibly. The war ended in the way that internal assessments had suggested it might end, and the information that had supported those assessments had been suppressed and managed so thoroughly that the ending felt, publicly, like a sudden collapse rather than a predictable conclusion. The evacuation of Saigon, which included roughly 7,000 Americans and about 135,000 Vietnamese who had worked with American forces or the South Vietnamese government, left behind an unknown number of Vietnamese who had been promised evacuation and did not receive it. The chaos of the final days, the burning of documents, the abandonment of equipment and supplies, the scenes at the embassy, was not simply a logistical failure. It was the endpoint of a policy that had consistently prioritized the maintenance of a certain narrative over planning for the actual range of outcomes. The Vietnamese who were left behind, many of whom were subsequently imprisoned in what the North Vietnamese government called re-education camps, where conditions were harsh and where significant numbers of people died, were a category that did not fit easily into the narrative either of heroic American effort or of peaceful resolution. They existed outside the story that was being told, as many of the war's human costs had existed outside the official story throughout. The classified history of the war, the full history that lives in documents that have been declassified incrementally over 50 years and in some cases remain partially or fully classified today, is a history that shows a system producing a certain kind of output with a certain kind of efficiency. The output was not victory. The output was not even a coherent definition of what victory would mean. The output was continuation. The system produced continuation. It produced briefings and reports and metrics and programs and operations that kept the machinery running. The system had momentum. The system had institutional constituencies. The system had its own internal logic. And the system continued until external pressure, primarily in the form of collapsed public support and congressional action, made continuation impossible. The last American combat units left Vietnam in March 1973. American prisoners of war were returned between February and April of 1973 as Operation Homecoming. American advisors and support personnel remained in Vietnam until April 1975. The draft, which had fed the war with men who had not chosen to serve, ended in January 1973. The bombing of Cambodia continued until August 1973, when Congress legislated its termination. American financial and military support to South Vietnam continued until the final months of that year. In the years immediately following the war, the United States government conducted no comprehensive accounting of its conduct. There was no truth commission, no systematic inquiry into the gap between official representations and operational reality. There were congressional investigations into specific episodes, like the Church Committee's examination of intelligence community activities, which touched on aspects of Vietnam. There were the legal proceedings related to Watergate, which illuminated specific decisions about the bombing of Cambodia. There was Daniel Ellsberg's trial, which was dismissed after government misconduct by the same units involved in Watergate was disclosed. But there was no comprehensive reckoning with what the documented record showed about how the war had been conducted and how the American public had been informed about it. The documents continued to be declassified over the following decades. Each significant release, the Pentagon Papers in their fuller versions, the declassification of CORDS and Phoenix program records, the release of intelligence assessments and National Security Council deliberations, added detail to a picture whose broad outlines had been established by the early 1970s. The picture showed a war in which the distance between official claims and operational reality had been sustained through institutional effort over more than a decade, in which the human costs of that effort had been borne primarily by soldiers who were told they were fighting for defined objectives, by Vietnamese civilians who were not consulted about the war being conducted on their territory, and by veterans who returned to a country that did not have the frameworks to understand what they had experienced. By 1974, the last year before the final collapse, South Vietnamese forces were conducting operations with insufficient fuel, ammunition, and air support because American appropriations had been reduced. Their equipment was degrading faster than it could be replaced or repaired. The military assessments of South Vietnamese capability that had been used to justify Vietnamization and the American withdrawal had been optimistic in ways that internal critics had noted and that the course of events would confirm. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam had real soldiers who fought real battles and suffered real casualties, and the framing of Vietnamization as a policy success did not match the conditions those soldiers were fighting under. When the end came, it came quickly, partly because of how thoroughly the material and institutional basis of South Vietnamese military effectiveness had been undermined by the combination of American withdrawal and the corruption that American money had helped sustain for a decade. The war killed somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5 million Vietnamese, depending on the methodology and the period covered. It killed approximately 58,000 Americans in combat and related operations. It killed somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 South Vietnamese military personnel. It killed significant but poorly documented numbers of Laotians and Cambodians. The uncertainty in those figures is itself a product of the war's information environment. In a conflict where body counts were inflated and civilian casualties were misclassified and records were falsified and some events were not reported at all, the final casualty figures carry the same epistemic weight as everything else the war produced. They are estimates, shaped by institutional processes, incomplete, and likely more accurate about American losses than about anyone else's. The last American soldier to die in the Vietnam War in a combat context was killed during the Mayaguez incident in May 1975 after Saigon had already fallen in an operation to recover an American merchant vessel seized by Cambodian forces. 41 American service members were killed in that operation, which was launched before diplomatic channels were fully exhausted, under conditions that later analysis suggested might have been resolved without military action. The ship's crew, it was eventually established, had already been released before the military operation began. The 41 Americans who died in the Mayaguez operation died after the war had ended, pursuing an objective that no longer existed, in a conflict whose stated purposes had dissolved years before its final casualty was recorded.